Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Before we go on any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Still trying to recover from that hack about a week and a half ago. But now on to the matter at hand. We got another solo album review, this time of the newest project from Emily Scott Robinson, American Siren. I think this might be my most anticipated album of 2021. And I'm not sure it's particularly close either. When Emily Scott Robinson came out of the indie country folk scene to blow my mind so many times over with Traveling Mercies in 2019, I was convinced I had just heard one of the biggest new talents to break out in that decade. And that project, indeed, is among my top 10 over the course of those 10 years. Not only was she an excellent singer with a sweetness that reminded me a lot of early Casey Musgraves, she also had a command of atmosphere and a willingness to touch upon far darker subject matter, and the sort of singer-songwriter who really deserved more of the spotlight, even if none of it was guaranteed coming out of the indie scene. It's why, full disclosure on my part, I did not hesitate to back her when she launched a Kickstarter to fund this new album, one that met and exceeded its goals shockingly quickly, and that was a nice surprise. But I guess I shouldn't have been that surprised when folks were actually starting to take notice. She got signed to the late John Prine's Old Boy Records, which led to a more robust promotional budget, and suddenly it wasn't just me throwing all the critical acclaim her way. And while I am very tempted to say I was ahead of the punch here, it's not really about me. I was just overjoyed to cover what could easily wind up as one of my favorite country folk singer-songwriter albums of 2021, and what feels like an absolutely stacked year for those subgenres. Now, that also meant I had some sky-high expectations, which after a quick re-listen to Traveling Mercies did feel absolutely justified, but I was also going in pretty cold. I mostly avoided all the singles to make sure I could really take this all in all at once. So did Emily Scott Robinson deliver? Well, yeah, of course she did. And my god, it's such a relief. It's so thrilling to see an artist you think has sky-high potential deliver in spades, in both meeting and in some cases surpassing all of my expectations. But American Siren is also a very different animal than Traveling Mercies in the details, and I'd argue it's a more complicated listen. Traveling Mercies had this sense of free-flowing momentum and motion throughout the runtime, which kept the pace up, and while it did touch on some really dark and more mature subject matter, it felt more accessible as a whole. American Siren, meanwhile, is darker, heavier, a little bit slower, feeling more settled and textured within itself. Can you tell it was written over the course of the past couple of years? And it pulls you deeper into its own atmosphere rather than taking you for a ride. Kind of fitting, given the themes that Emily Scott Robinson described around this project, and it allows American Siren to showcase some utterly incredible high points, but it can be a tougher, slightly more demanding listen, even if I am going to say it's pretty goddamn incredible along for it. Part of that is rooted in the texture and approach to this album, which has a lot of subtlety and layers that can make it a little tough to quantify, especially in comparison with a lot of the indie country that's got some of that homespun texture. Here, the edges, they feel a little rougher. The bass lines quiver, the deeper acoustics pick up more organic texture to accentuate the melodic tones. The organs and pianos, they feel a little rougher around the edges, and once again, the fiddles hit that precise, immaculate balance of richness and ragged texture that I have always loved with so much of her work. And at least there's so many striking instrumental moments, how the strings and the guitars will ride out of the mist to the sandy skitter of the percussion on Things You Learn the Hard Way with a terrific fiddle solo, the pedal steel and the wells of organ on If Trouble Comes A-Lookin', the jaunty break of Cheap Seats that fills in the white-hot country mess mold to lighten some of the mood midway through the album, the sheer warmth on all the arrangements of Lost Woman's Prayer and Lightning in a Bottle, and especially the acoustic plucks that interpolate taps at the end of Hometown Hero, which was kind of inspired and somehow wound up working even better than if they had used a proper trumpet. But from there, you're also very much acutely aware just how much more air everything has to breathe. But while Traveling Mercies used all the negative space to accentuate a lot of very lonely journeys, this creates a much more enveloping sense of atmosphere, where you're aware of every creak and tremble of the acoustic instrumentation, especially when it comes to Emily Scott Robinson's voice, where her sweet, trilling vibrato is all the more present. I have to emphasize, once again, how wonderfully charismatic and expressive she is as a singer here, and both some of the brighter and more infectious moments, and the ones that are gonna rip your heart out. But even then, with the touches of a distinctly feminine backing vocal starting straight from the starting track, Old Gods, the descriptor that kept coming to mind for me was mystical. That separates her from a lot of country in this lane. It places her closer to certain stripes of folk, but even then, her approach to the texture here feels kind of unique. It's not calling back to old European antiquity in the same way some will, nor does it feel flighty or wound up within glamours. No, the heaviness feels more grounded, lived in, with an American indie country flavor to a lot of the writing, where if the witch that lived on the edge of town, she's lived there for decades, and there can be some comfort in approaching her friendly wisdom, even if she might show you some things you would never expect. And that does feed the writing really well, specifically surrounding some of the themes and the framing. Robinson has described the root of this album being in the things that call to us, the Siren songs that we can't resist, specifically to women, as there's this aura of divine feminine resonance in both the themes and the stylism that I really haven't observed since a few songs on The Highwomen or that Spelling album from earlier this year. And while of course Robinson is going to add more real moral complexity with her level-handed framing, we'll get to it, you get traces of that sense of magic by the first song, Old Gods, which has the structure of a nursery rhyme, but often serves more of a reminder of how said nursery rhymes are often appropriated from an older, more pagan lineage. And the context of faith and that intangible tug, it's all over this album. Some critics have framed this as a loss of faith, but I'd argue it's closer to losing one's religion and finding faith in something more resonant and inexplicable, especially when the old systems show themselves as unable to deliver that intangible feeling. On the one hand, you got the homespun, Laurie McKenna-esque wisdom of things you learn the hard way, or the middle-aged love story of Lightning in a Bottle, where she reflects upon the ease of youth and how she nearly pushed it all away and wonders what could have been lost if different choices were made when love was magic, as she describes herself, or leaning into the pleas of everyday and faith that will still call her there. But then you got a song like Hometown Hero, where there's a story of a small town guy who's the pride of the town, who then goes off to war in Afghanistan, comes back to try to live a normal life and have a family, but then commits suicide, leaving children behind. It's a tangled mess of moral uncertainties for which Emily Scott Robinson has never shied away, but it highlights by their absence the systems that might have saved him. Keep in mind that she's always had a knack for the small details that mask the real gut punches and all the little transgressions, and that's just as true here. From sneaking off of a dead-end restaurant shift to write songs on cheap seats, to the playful sense of sisterhood and friendship on Lost Woman's Prayer, to the cheating song of If Trouble Comes A-Lookin', where instead of playing for darkness or more angst, she highlights a remarkably romantic encounter between a married woman and a priest at a hotel bar, and it's almost playfully joyous in all the sincerity of it all. Not every infidelity is bound to end in shame. I'm frankly amazed that she pulled off the balancing act of framing to make it feel so enticing where you wind up rooting for it, but again, it's more losing one's religion and finding a different, more vibrant strain of faith. But then there's the album's centerpiece, Let 'Em Burn. It's a quaking, spare piano ballad where Emily Scott Robinson sings from the perspective of a married woman who sees her religion now as empty ritual, her marriage is unfulfilling, and despite every constraint that she put up around herself, this is the moment where it all breaks down. Again, the power of this song not just comes from the weight of all the history that you can feel in all the details, that she might have gotten everything that she wanted or that she told herself that she wanted, but now she's questioning everything when she's not satisfied, realizing that if she truly leaves everything, that could change everything, including her, and the weight of that unknown is even greater, especially if there are kids in the other room. The key line is, what if desire is a gift and not a sin? The sort of line that is most deeply rooted in the modern feminine experience, but is delivered so powerfully in the context and execution that the resonance becomes transcendent. It's the best song on the album, possibly the best song Emily Scott Robinson has written to date, easily one of the best songs I've heard in 2021. It's just one of those songs that'll move me to tears every time I've heard it. And I mean, that's impressive. And it's also why, in one of my few criticisms of this album, I gotta wonder why it's placed so early in the track list, not even at the halfway point. This album already has some minor issues with momentum, and Let 'Em Burn is so striking, it probably could have been placed later on in the track list. It would have worked just fine, it still would have stood out. But I've got some other quibbles here too. Less of a focus on groove means the back half of the album can feel a little bit slow, even if you are enraptured by the writing. I don't quite love the organ line shuddering off the bass on Everyday in Faith, even if the bass and the fiddle do sound terrific. And like with Traveling Mercies, not really a fan of how the album ends. I get why Emily Scott Robinson did a bluegrass-leaning cover of Old North State, a state toast for North Carolina, and in the context of the album, it does make sense. It's a very chipper, upbeat closer that once again has her called home, but I don't know, it feels a little bit too neat and tidy of an ending for a project that has so many moments where the conclusion is not yet known, and I feel like a little bit more could have resonated if going in that direction. But I also know at this point I'm nitpicking, and this album, it's fantastic. The production's top-notch, the delivery is excellent, the songwriting can go to-toe with anyone in any genre. It's a subtle and layered experience that still has so much resonant power. I'm legitimately thrilled to see more people actually getting on board this year. It's so well-deserved. But I'd also add that I think this could have some resonance beyond just the indie country crowd. Some of that is because the overall quality is just that obvious and just so great, but with the subtle mystique and the approach to some of these themes, I'd argue there are parallels you can make to some of Fiona Apple's writing or Nico Case. The Lilith Fair crowd would have adored this 20 plus years ago, where that siren call will take you to a place on the edge of another world. One familiar maybe, but one also daring you to choose that unknown. And I don't think I can add any more to any sort of endorsement. 9 out of 10. One of the best albums of 2021. Emily Scott Robinson knocked another one out of the goddamn park, and you're now running out of excuses to not be on board, so please, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be more than grateful. Again, I'll say it. I really appreciate everyone getting back on board to help recover the channel. It's been very much appreciated. Again, still trying to keep up with the momentum. That's why I'm doing a few more solo reviews. But again, I was going to give this one a solo review anyway. It is just that incredible. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule so I can talk about them in some form, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated to, but hey, if you want to get albums on my schedule, chat with me on my Discord, a couple other perks, there's the option. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.